Yeah, let's start.
Okay, for anyone who doesn't know, my name is David Carkey, and I'm going to talk to you guys about internal combustion engines. This is called an introduction to internal combustion engines. So I just want to ask real quick, how many people in the class, show of hands, use a car, drive a car on a regular or semi-regular basis? Okay, so fairly the majority basically of the class, if not everyone's class. So basically, it's a good idea to have an idea of how the car works, just in case anything goes wrong, just so that the guy at the repair shop doesn't just take you for a ride and tell you, anything he wants to tell you. And so that's what this presentation is about, just to give you a little peek inside the hood of the car, give you the basics of what a combustion engine is. So, can anyone give me a definition for a combustion? Just combustion. Quick definition.
Burn.
Burn, right? Something that burns is like combusting, or something in this case that's exploding. So combustion is has three elements that make up combustion. Oxygen, heat, and fuel are required for combustion. And so if you have a lack of any one of these, then obviously you're not going to get combustion. So these are the big three things that you need in your car. So oxygen is usually just taken in from the outside air for use by your car. The heat comes in the form of spark plugs. We'll get to that a little bit later. And the fuel, of course, is gasoline. Or sometimes, I guess now we're getting into something more like hydrogen or alternative fuel sources. But basically, those are the three things that are required for combustion: oxygen, heat, and fuel. So here's a little, a quick diagram of combustion. So what happens when something explodes or burns is that the vapors expand. And see here, these arrows are symbolizing the expansion of the gases around this explosion. So when something is burning or exploding, very often you have this sort of like force that's just sitting there sort of idle or waiting to be tapped into, I guess, is the idea here that I'm sort of driving towards, is that an explosion in this raw form is going to go all over the place. So some really brilliant person came along and said, well, hey, we have this explosion. What if we could take the multi-directional explosion and direct it in a certain way? So that's what this is a really basic diagram of an internal combustion engine. This is like cross-cut. And so, when you have the explosion, everything's going everywhere. The engine is directing the explosion to go one way, in this case up and down. The piston's going to go up and down, which is going to rotate this, the crankshaft. We'll get to that a little bit later. And once that starts moving, that turns into rotational motion, which gets put down to the wheels. So here's a quiz. Just in your head or on a sheet of paper, everyone name the three things that are required for combustion. You can do it in your head, you don't need to write it down, but everyone will give you a minute to do that. Could be. Okay, so someone name off one thing that's required for combustion.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, okay, oxygen is one of them. What else? Gas or fuel, right? And heat, correct. Okay, so we're going to start using names for all these parts. This is, again, that cross-section of a combustion engine. So here we have the spark plug, that's what provides heat. Intake valve is where the air comes in. Exhaust valve is where the expended air goes out. So the ring goes around the piston, and here's your piston, and this is the thing that goes up and down. And the cylinder is basically, it's called the cylinder, the compression chamber. There's this place right here that the piston's in. And then you have your piston rod, your connecting rod, or just your rod is sometimes what it's called. And then here's the crankshaft that the rod and the piston are connected to. And there's a lot more than this. I mean, the cam shafts would be running to the intake and exhaust valve and adjusting those. And so this is a very basic view. At the same time, this is like a working model of what an engine basically is. And so we're going to go through, most engines these days are 4-stroke engines. And that means like a 4-stroke engine is an engine that goes through 4 very distinct states, I guess is the easiest way to explain it to you, computer science people. 4 very distinct states. So let's see, it starts at, I'm going to wait till it gets back to the beginning combustion. Okay. So here's intake, and then you have compression, then you have ignition, or combustion, and then you have exhaust. And so what it's going to do is it's going to suck air in, and it's going to compress that, and then give fuel, and then you're going to have the spark for combustion, and then you're going to have exhaust. And notice how these valves, that one's shut during, actually, we'll step forward. For intake, this valve is shut. That's the exhaust valve. And so nothing's going to go out, but the intake valve is open. And so here you have air and probably fuel. Fuel will be sprayed in, I guess, really, these days. But what's going to happen is that the air is going to come in here for intake. This piston moves down, it sort of sucks the air in just because it creates a vacuum, and so the outside atmosphere will simply just fill that vacuum with stuff, which in this case is air. So number 1, intake. Number 2, compression. This is where the air gets compressed so that you can fit more air, I guess, or really you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, that kind of idea. And so it compresses everything, kind of gets everything mixed together right, too, so that there's no just, I guess, gaps is how to put it, like in the solution. You want everything to be as tight as it can be. And I'll get to that later, too, because a way of increasing horsepower is by compressing the air. It's called forced induction. So this is the compression stage. You want to compress everything and get it all nice and tight and packed in there in the compression chamber, the combustion chamber. Number 3 is power, or combustion. And this is when the spark plug fires, and that's when the whole mix just explodes, driving this piston down. And the act of driving the piston down again spins this crankshaft, which goes to the wheels, makes the wheels move. And then finally, after you've done your explosion, you have the exhaust, where you take all that junk that you don't want, all those vapors and gases and whatever, and just shoot it out, your exhaust, which is the tailpipe. We all know what the exhaust is, hopefully, I'm assuming. Okay. Increasing output. So now that we have a simple engine, well, let's make it, better. Let's make this a really high horsepower engine. What do we need to do? Well, we can make the engine bigger, which means more fuel. Basically, you're going to have to increase one of the components of combustion. You're going to need more fuel, more oxygen, or Schroeder and I were debating this actually, whether more heat would actually give you more horsepower, but that's a whole other story. So basically what they use predominantly is more fuel, where you'll have the difference between a V4 and an I4, up in engine a V4. An I4, inline 4 or 4-cylinder engine, and then a 6-cylinder engine. It's just that there's more area for compression, or more area for combustion, I'm sorry. So if you have more area that you can use there, more cylinders, then you can use more fuel, throw more fuel in there, get more explosions going at the same time, thus increasing the power of the output of the engine. And also, another way that they do it, if you don't want to go with a bigger engine wasting fuel, a lot of times they'll do forced induction. This is where you talk about superchargers or a turbocharged engine, where they'll take the oxygen and compress it, and once the oxygen is compressed, you can shove more oxygen into the combustion chamber, and so when it combusts, it's basically giving more fuel, more power, but the only drawback is that it makes the engine very complicated, and there's a lot more things that can go wrong. So you're either looking at a price increase with a bigger engine, or you're looking at a complexity increase with a turbocharger or supercharger. By the way, naturally aspirated is what an engine's called if it's just sucking air from the outside. If you're forcing an air in with a turbo or a supercharger, it's called a forced induction engine. Makes sense. Forced induction, you're pushing there. Okay, so you're not getting out of my class without passing my final. Name or describe the 4 stages of a 4-stroke engine. Again, you can do it in your head, do it on a piece of scratch paper, any way you can do it. Give you guys a moment to think about it. 4 stages of a 4-stroke engine.
get.
No. No, it's an exothermic reaction. You can't add heat to make it run better.
Well, okay.
The reason why you have multiple spark plugs in some engines is because then you get a much more the explosion takes place in multiple areas inside that little bitty compressed chamber. At the same time, it gives you a much more uniform and complete combustion process. And then what you have is lowered emissions. That too.
Well, but you'd also get more bang for your buck. So that is kind of a way to increase efficiency more than power.
Yeah.
It's diminishing returns, but it's also relatively cheap. So it's kind of like you put 2 spark plugs per cylinder. The Super Constellation aircraft from the 1950s had 18 cylinder engines times 4, and 2 spark plugs per cylinder. So that's 144 spark plugs if my math is correct.
Yeah.
And if one of them went out, the whole engine had to be shut down.
Yeah, that's why like diesel engines don't even use spark plugs. They just rely on the fact that the compression is so high in that combustion chamber that the heat, when you compress a gas, it increases the heat of the gas. And so when you compress it so much that it just combusts on its own without adding any heat to it. That's
What's that really
diesel engine. Okay, Jen, you got one for me? Intake. Okay. Number 1, yeah, intake. Okay. Anyone else? So can we do them in order? So anyone know number 2?
Compression.
Compression, right? And then number 3, Warren.
Ignite.
Ignition, yeah. And then number 4, Schroeder.
Exhaust.
Or is it exhaust? Okay. Any questions?